New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern arrived in China for a short yet important visit to her country's largest trading partner. As the first developed country to launch a free trade agreement and recognize China as a market economy, New Zealand remains an important partner for China in the Pacific region, in the Asia-Pacific region. What is the significance of the trip at a time when Ardern's administration is still coping with the aftermath of the Christchurch terror attack? How should we view the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and New Zealand in the context of regional integration and global governance? And what new impetus can we expect to be injected into the country's relations? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Su Hao from China Foreign Affairs University and Hafiz Ardern, a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. We shall also be joined via satellite by David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Gentlemen, what do you think should be the top concerns on the agenda of Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern during her very first official visit since she took office 18 months ago? Professor Su.
Well, actually, we know that as a Western country, a bilateral relation between China and New Zealand is very much mature. I would like to give several first defines our bilateral relations. New Zealand was the Western country in the first group of Western countries to have established relation with China, and New Zealand was the first to sign the FTA agreement documents with China. New Zealand was the first to recognize China as a market economy, and of course, New Zealand, have China as the first country in trade partners in its trade relation with outside of the world. So I would say that these two countries have very good relation with each other. So this time, Prime Minister Ardern come to China, to Beijing. We have tried to enhance our bilateral relation with each other, getting start from our mature relation. I would say that first, maybe we should have enhance our mutual trust with each other. Even though we have the good relation with each other, but last year some uncertainty between us because the United States has launched the trade war against China and make some negative influence on its allies like New Zealand. So there's some kind of uncertain comments from New Zealand to define Chinese New Zealand relations. Yes, so I would say that this time when the Prime Minister comes to China, so we kind of reconfirm our mature relation with each other.
I don't think the relations have been that good during this Prime Minister's term of office. So I think the visit is an opportunity to set it back on its traditionally historic course. But there were several bumps in the road. One was what the professor mentioned about the U.S. interference. But New Zealand has done a lot to shoot itself in the foot. Two respects. Number one, they quite quickly dismissed Huawei and 5G technology. I'm sure this is going to be an item for discussion, and hopefully they'll follow what the EU has done, which has allowed for more study and discussion of the security aspects. And I think in the interim, Huawei's done a lot, so that's why it should be revisited. Also, the Prime Minister's administration shot themselves in the foot because her foreign minister, giving a speech in Washington last year, said that America should become more engaged in the region to balance off from China. And he did that without checking with his boss, the Prime Minister. So I think there's some explanations that will have to be given, and maybe are being given at this day.
And do you think trust reconstruction will first and foremost be the most important issue between the two governments during Jacinda Ardern's visit?
Yes, I think that, as I mentioned, that these two countries already have a very good relation with each other. But last year, because some official documents released from New Zealand government to define China something like the uncertain threat to the New Zealand national security, and the Chinese enhance its presence in the South Pacific. So there's some kind of uncertainty to define Chinese role within New Zealand, because more and more Chinese people live in New Zealand. So they worry about, some comment from the mass media say that they worry about the Chinese influence inside of New Zealand society. Of course, it's just some kind of fake news, actually, in my point, right? But this time, when these two leaders sit together, we can reconfirm our immature and relation with each other, and then so that we can say that New Zealand could be recognized that China is a real strategic partner with its country.
A senior official from the U.S. government says perhaps the membership of New Zealand for the Five Eyes Alliance should be reconsidered, given its very strong economic and even political tie with the PRC. What do you think of the issue of having to consolidate the united front between New Zealand and other members of the Five Eyes?
Well, I think this is very typical of the United States conduct, that their government, our government, is putting its nose in places where it doesn't belong and trying to force countries to do things against their national interest. So I think that they should let the relationship stand and not try to redefine the relationship by New Zealand or anybody else for that matter.
New Zealand does not stand alone in the area where China and the West relationship should be redefined. Look at the recent outcome of President Xi Jinping's visit to Italy and Paris, France, where President Xi Jinping had a wonderful and fruitful meeting with Juncker, Angela Merkel, and Emmanuel Macron, of course, to discuss the future of the bilateral relationship between the EU and China. Therefore, do you think the US government is actually fighting an uphill battle in putting its allies together? I mean, after President Trump vows and put into practice the idea of putting America first.
Yes, New Zealand is the allies of the United States, traditionally, right? In the recent years, because Americans try to launch its negative confrontation against China, so try to ask its allies around the so-called Indo-Pacific area to take the side with the United States, to prepare something from China. For example, like the 5G issue, Huawei's, the bans Huawei's investment into New Zealand or other countries. So New Zealand, I would say, actually, on the one hand, they are the traditional allies of the United States, so they have to listen to or be careful about Americans' relation with New Zealand. But on the other hand, in reality, so China and New Zealand has a very close relation with each other, in particular the economic and even the people-to-people relations are very much closer than the United States. So I would say that's, yeah.
Thank you very much. Let me cross over to David Mahone, who's standing by in Sydney, and he's from New Zealand. He stayed in China for a number of years, witnessing the remarkable evolution of this very meaningful bilateral economic and political relationship between New Zealand and China. David, what do you make of the top concerns of your Prime Minister, who's currently visiting China 18 months after she took office? Why did it take so long for her to come over?
Well, I think my fellow guests have identified the issues very clearly. New Zealand had 30 years of being essentially non-aligned. It did belong to Five Eyes, but in that arrangement, which was an intelligence sharing arrangement, it was the country that resisted American warships coming to New Zealand ports on its anti-nuclear free stance. New Zealand didn't go to the Iraq War, rejecting it as an illegal war. And throughout this whole process, it's always managed to follow its own course. So this has been an unusual experience for our people to see that we've now got this falling out with China. But the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, manages a coalition. And one aspect of that coalition is a slightly far-right party. It wouldn't go as far as some far-right parties in the world. And they've acted to some extent alone. As our colleague in Australia also highlighted, there have been speeches and statements that were not vetted by the Prime Minister. So when the Prime Minister spoke a month ago saying that Huawei was not banned, but was undergoing a process of assessment, looking at security concerns, China realised that maybe our government has not moved from its core positions of the last 30 years. So this visit is very important. She would not be invited by the government of China unless there was a sense that there was some grounds to have a good conversation and there was a possibility that Huawei would be approved. I think there is a chance that Huawei will be approved. If it is not, and perceived to be rejected on political grounds, then there will be trade retaliation of quite a measure. So New Zealand has to think very carefully about not being close to Beijing, but not being drawn towards the Trump administration and its designs, and going back to its position of relative non-alignment.
You've put your finger on a very interesting point as to how serious the division proves across the social spectrum of public opinions in the United States at this moment. The United States has been so divided. Now, David, after all, New Zealand is the first Western country and a democracy to have signed an agreement on FTA with China, and is the first of Western countries to recognize the market economic status of China. Given such a wide margin, what do you make of the future of our bilateral relationship? Is it possible for Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern to adopt a dual-track policy towards China? Security, yes. After all, it has the obligations and commitments to the treaty alliance between Washington and Wellington. On the other hand, after all, we are your biggest trading partner. So what do you think of the feasibility of adopting a dual-track policy regarding China?
Well, I don't think that any country can adopt dual-track policies. It's a statement politicians use, but it is actually inaccurate. In reality, New Zealand has a relationship in Five Eyes which is intelligence sharing. There is no treaty. There is no military or strategic alliance between America and New Zealand. There was one called ANZUS that ended over 25 years ago. We don't have any arrangement with any country. And we need to recognize our own rules, our own legal system, our own principles, and those of international law. And following that, we can have a very good relationship with China. We can have a good economic relationship. And on political matters, we can conduct ourselves as we have throughout the whole South China Sea controversy, which is where it doesn't relate directly to international law, we leave it to those in discussion to sort things out for themselves. And I think there is a sense that the region can resolve its own issues amongst themselves. But there is no sense in most New Zealanders thinking that they want America to come back and be stronger in the region. We all remember the Vietnam War and the debacle that was the end of that war. So New Zealand is not an ally of the United States. New Zealand is non-allied, but we are a very close friend of China's and have been for really since 1972, when our Prime Minister then, Norman Kirk, a Labour Prime Minister, joined a handful of Western countries in recognising China diplomatically. So you can't serve two masters, you can't keep two wives, I suppose, politically. So New Zealand must remain singular. It must look at its interests with China and be fair in terms of its understanding of trade issues. Huawei is a political issue. It follows the arrest of CFO Meng in Canada that New Zealand was asked to make a statement, and sadly our security services did. But for us now to reject Huawei would be to cement in the thinking in Beijing that we were moving back to Washington. And so I think we're in a very difficult position, but as long as we can look at Huawei on principle and see it as not a threat, we will have a platform to continue as we used to continue, as an objective and trusted trading partner.
David, the trip was cut short. As Ardern said, it didn't seem appropriate to stay longer after the March 15th Christchurch mosque shootings. What underlying issues were brought to attention by the incident, and how will it affect domestic policies in New Zealand, David?
I think the tragedy in Christchurch is a New Zealand tragedy, but it's a tragedy that could have occurred in nearly any so-called Christian country where there is a measure of far-right and extremist thinking, or for that matter, where there is any marginalised section of society. In New Zealand, There are people who do not live well. There are people who live in relative poverty. There is a small segment, a small aspect of this far-right thinking in New Zealand. I think that as a country we have become complacent. We have a very good relationship with our indigenous people, the Maori people, and the Pacific Islanders who live in New Zealand. And because of that, we have patted ourselves on the back and said that we are unique amongst Western countries in our understanding or acceptance of other cultures. But actually, we are okay, but we have taken a lot for granted, and our society is changing dynamically. There are more and more people coming to live in New Zealand from all over the world, and particularly from Asia. And I think we were somewhat negligent in paying attention to some of the forces in society that were reacting to that. They are very small, and I do not believe we are intrinsically a racist society. But now New Zealand must be vigilant, because of what happened in Christchurch shows that that did happen in our country. This is an aspect of us, and all countries, even China, needs to consider minority and difference and be very careful to be sure that there is a true understanding of the other, because in the end people fear the stranger and react. So it's been a big wake-up call. I'm very pleased to see the leadership of Jacinda Ardern. She conducted herself from a foreigner watching from Beijing, living in China, watching from Beijing, and a New Zealander very well. And the banning of assault weapons was done, I think, within 12 days. So those moves are good, but we must continue to root out that underlying racism that exists in all societies, in the minds and the hearts of the majority. And in that sense, it's not just a New Zealand problem, it's a universal problem.
Thank you so much, David. You are watching Dialogue with Harvey Zordin, Professor Su Hao, and David Mahon. We're discussing issues concerning the agenda of Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand and what's going to happen after the March the 15th terrorist attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Harvey, what do you think of David's analysis about the unique independence of New Zealand's foreign policy, particularly its relationship with the PRC?
First of all, I wanted to say that our hearts go out to the people who died and the many people that affected, because it doesn't only affect New Zealand, it affects the whole world. And as to what David had talked about, this is a worldwide problem that has to be addressed on a worldwide basis. When I look at a country like New Zealand, and there's lots of New Zealands these days because of the Trump administration, I see a figure of a person in a tug of war with the United States pulling this way and China pulling that way. And it shouldn't have to be like that. People, countries have to act in their own national interest, and they don't always have to make an either-or decision. So the bottom line has to be that the nations have to learn to get along with each other, whether it's like David said, that the nation is neutral, like New Zealand, or you have different policies to suit different aspects of your national interest. So I really fault the Trump administration for making nations choose as opposed to work multilaterally through international institutions and so on to address these kinds of problems.
Professor Su, you have followed policy making and the security strategy of countries on our periphery in the Asia-Pacific region for years. What do you think of the alleged independence of New Zealand in shaping their relationship and even future with China?
Yeah, I would like to add one more point regarding the New Zealand's relation with the United States. We know that it is the ally with each other, right? But New Zealand is different with some other Americans, military and security allies in Asia Pacific. We know that in the Cold War period, New Zealand already rejected the Americans' the deployment of its nuclear submarines on the New Zealand territorial water. So the reason for this reason, so their economic and military relation, already changeable. So that means they're not really defines its allies in the security and military implication. So by this way, that means New Zealand political and security's backdrop, which is different with some other allies. The reason why it has a good foundation for its relation with China in political and economic way.
The second issue that David Mahon dwelled upon very well on the crossover was how serious the consequences have been arising from the shootings in Christchurch, particularly gun control. Now, the shootings were live streaming on Facebook and watched 4,000 times before it was removed and before the release of such video was outlawed by the New Zealand government. Of course, you have the National Rifle Association and the Second Amendment in the United States, a highly developed military-industrial complex, and a pretty high number of casualties related to gun violence each year, particularly the tragic and regrettable ones on the campus each year in the United States. So what do you think of New Zealand, where we have this tragic killing of so many people?
Of course, it's a terrible situation, but when you compare United States to New Zealand, it's apples and oranges, because you've got a country of less than 5 million people in one case and a huge superpower in the other, with a tremendous amount of difference of opinions. And even well before President Trump, there was this split between the Second Amendment right to bear arms people. So I think it's easier to reach a consensus in a small country like New Zealand, especially when probably everybody in the country was impacted or knew somebody who knew somebody who was involved in this terrible terrorist activity. Whereas in America, we're numb now. There's been so many deaths by guns, semi-automatic guns, and the NRA is not changing its position. There are signs in America, though, that people are starting to pay attention. I think last year, more money was spent by anti-gun forces than by pro-gun forces. So I believe that maybe, and we'll see a lot of discussion in the presidential campaign about this, maybe things are going to change.
Professor Su, as the first Western country to have signed a memorandum concerning BRI, a second BRI Cooperation Forum will soon take place in Beijing. How important is it for us to have New Zealand a partner along the stretches of BRI?
Well, New Zealand and China already have their signatures of the FTA in 2008, right? And since then, we have a very good relation with each other in economic, trade, and social and cultural and tourist cooperation with each other, right? So that means that China and New Zealand already have a very close relation in the framework of BRI's scope. So New Zealand already has their officials recognition of the Chinese BRI initiative. So actually this year we have the second round of BRI's forum. So New Zealand already have a commitment to say that they would like to send their senior official. Maybe I think that could be their economic development minister come to Beijing for the second round of BRI's forum. So I would say that New Zealand already has a very good partner for the China and enhance our cooperation in the framework of BRI. And actually, within the BRI, China will have their Maritime Silk Road Initiative, right? So New Zealand in the South Pacific could be the pillar in the South Pacific to enhance our cooperation in the framework of the BRI, in particular the Maritime Silk Road framework. So I would say New Zealand, as a Western country, could be taking a leading position to enhance the cooperation. By this way, they set a good model for the cooperation between China and other Western countries in the framework of BRI.
But I think they have some deficiency in New Zealand, and that is that a survey done last year of New Zealand citizens showed that only 15% of the population knew what Belt and Road Initiative was. So in a democracy where people are having input to their governance, they have to be informed citizens. So I think the government there, and Chinese government for that matter, needs to do a better job of informing New Zealand citizens of the benefit. I think one of the most intriguing things that could come out of the BRI participation by New Zealand is a proposal to use New Zealand as a transit point or as a facilitation point between China and Latin America. Now, United States is pushing a neo-Monroe doctrine, trying to keep other powers out of Latin America, saying it's ours, stay away. But China, through BRI, is trying to facilitate free and open trade with Latin America. And it's interesting that New Zealand, so far away from anywhere in a way, can be, or is planned to be, a transit point, a facilitation point for trade between Latin America and China in both directions.
David, given the decline in trust between Washington and Beijing, particularly the negative impact of trade disputes, what do you think of, say, the cancellation or distrust for schools of Confucius in North America? At the same time, I'm aware that there are over 60,000 primary school students learning Mandarin in New Zealand, David. Congratulations. And what do you make of the contrast between Washington and New Zealand regarding the influence of Chinese culture and even the command of Mandarin as one of the major languages in facilitating flow of trade?
Well, I think as my colleague identified, to compare New Zealand really to any other country is very difficult because we are the most isolated country. We have Australians and penguins as neighbours. We really are a place where there's quite a lot of isolation of mind too. Nonetheless, the Confucius Institutes in New Zealand have actually had a very positive history. I know many of the people who are involved in running them. Some of them are our more senior diplomats who have moved across to be major leaders in the Confucius Institute system. And yes, they've worked very, very determinedly in getting Chinese language into schools. So it is an achievement. I think we've got further to go. When you have a country that still teaches German and French, important in terms of some of our cultural history, nonetheless as tools for the modern day, not as useful. I think Chinese needs to be even more widespread in New Zealand schools, but the trend is there. I don't think New Zealanders have a negative view of Chinese people at all, nor of Chinese culture, but I think we've identified other issues such as the ignorance of China, and that's a problem for most Western countries. But isolated countries like mine need to make an extra effort to overcome their isolation, and yes, our economic relationship and cultural relationship with China is very much important for our future.
This year, 2019, will be the year of tourism for New Zealand. Do you expect more Chinese tourists to go to your country, David? And what does that mean for the local industries or economy?
It's very positive. I think that the Chinese tourists are some of the highest spending. They carry away a good story of their experience in New Zealand. As long as we do not block Huawei, as long as our government approves Huawei to build 5G, which there is every reason that it should, all these things will flow very, very well. If we block Huawei, there will be the Chinese tourist agencies will not be encouraging people to go, trade will suffer, and we will have major economic impact. But we should do it for its own purposes, not because we are being told we'll be punished. Right now, America's threatening all sorts of things if we don't go along with its coercion of allies. We should stand up to that, and out of strength, not weakness, we should embrace our relationship with China, approve Huawei, and then things like the Year of Tourism will be a very strong year, and more Chinese tourists, particularly in the summer that's the summer that's coming at the end of this year, will be very good for our economy. It's our largest foreign exchange earner, very important for us.
Thank you, David, for being with us. In fact, nowhere could we buy luxuries such as Italian and French brands in New Zealand. But the most expensive luxury in New Zealand, I'm afraid, is the fresh air and environmentally friendly place and attitudes of ordinary folks in this country. Of course, New Zealand opens its arms for friendly Chinese in return. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.